More Like Home by Like to Laugh on AO3, Chapter 20. Zatanna took so long to arrive that by the time she did, Danny was struggling to stay awake, exhausted from the ordeal. Bruce knew from experience that unconsciousness offered little rest. Under normal circumstances, Bruce would leave Masters to be arrested and whisk his children away back to Gotham. But unfortunately, this situation was delicate and required Bruce's direct attention. Instead, Danny curled up on the couch under Batman's cape, a cold pack pressed to his neck, while Red Robin and Spoiler retreated to access the lab, and Red Hood and Black Bat stood guard over the detained Masters. Robin sat on Nightwing's other side and pretended not to doze. Masters himself had been roughly cleaned up by the bad-tempered Nightwing, his nose reset and the blood scrubbed off. He now sat between Red Hood and Black Bat, bound tightly at the knees, ankles, and wrists. His attention hadn't wavered from Danny once, leading Nightwing to pointedly shift between them. Bruce wondered if that man had ever realized how strange that was. Danny did not stir until Zatanna arrived, at which point he gasped out a soft breath of mist and blinked himself barely awake. "Ghost," Danny mumbled, sitting up with a visible wince, reaching up to hold the ice pack to his neck. "I requested Dead Man's presence," Bruce said. "He's a different variety of ghost from you. Cursebound rather than realms-born, according to Constantine's notes. But he may be able to help." "Batman." Zatanna gave him a nod as she approached, brisk and businesslike. "You mentioned the Ghost King." "That was a year ago," Danny griped. Then, "Hey, Dead Man, do you know how to do the Cyclovore thing?" Pause. "Don't give me that. I didn't get the usual orientation, okay? I didn't realize that I was getting most of the ecto I needed from the portal under my bedroom." Pause. "Stop making fun of me. I get enough of that from Vampire McGee." Masters bared his teeth at Danny. "Brat!" he snapped, and got chuffed over the head by Hood. Nightwing snorted, and then said in the direction Danny had been looking, "Give him a break, Boston. He's been half-starving for a month. Yeah, no, it's not funny. That's why he's asking you how to Cyclovore." Zatanna cleared her throat, drawing Bruce's attention back to her. "Your message was vague, even by your standards, Batman. Care to clarify?" "The matter is sensitive," Bruce growled, giving Masters a glance of distaste that the man sullenly returned. "Masters is another half-ghost. His alter ego, Plasmius, was responsible for several major incidents, including the release of the Ghost King. However, detaining him will be difficult without revealing his nature, and I would prefer to keep the existence of Half-us as secretive as possible, not only for Danny's sake, but also because the likes of, say, Waller or Luther learning about them could be disastrous." Zatanna glanced at Danny with raised eyebrows. Danny shrugged, unapologetic. "Vlad and I had an understanding." Privately, Bruce disagreed. He and Ivy had an understanding. Signal and the GCPD had an understanding. Danny and Masters had a brittle deadlock of blackmail control. Most likely, Masters had looped the Justice League into the Pact of Mutual Destruction Danny had mentioned, thus preventing him from seeking help through that avenue. "Or so I thought," Masters muttered. Danny gave him an irritated glare. I was just trying to live my life, he snapped, a painful croak shining through. More he raised his voice. You got yourself into this mess by acting like you own me or something. I didn't make you kidnap me, you know. Masters scoffed, but Santana took control of the conversation before he could retort. There are two logical problems here, she said. One is providing him with the ectoplasm in the quantities he requires. We can do that, but it'll take effort. The second is charging him with his crimes against the infinite realms without exposing him as half-ghost. Your suggestion? Bruce prompted. Plea deal, Zatanna said. I want access to Daniel, Masters demanded insistently. As if, Hood scoffed, jabbing Masters in the ribs, hard enough to make him double over with wheeze. A restraining order would be more appropriate. Bruce agreed. Masters' head snapped back up, the blood draining from his face, as if the man was only now starting to understand his predicament. This incident alone has proved more than enough reason for the court to grant it. Red Robin had already made a point of photographing Danny's injuries. Absolutely, Nightwing agreed. Robin tuttered in agreement, and Blackback grunted softly. Unfortunately, but not surprisingly, Danny looked conflicted, staring Masters with uneasy concern. But Danny trailed off, slowly lowering the cold pack to his lap. Masters is obsessed with Danny, Nightwing clarified for Zatanna, though the look gave Masters an unsympathetically to the point out of disdain. A restraining order might kill him, right? Zatanna pursed her lips, and Nightwing stiffened his attention to Danny. That said, you don't owe him anything. Zatanna nodded at that. There are other ways to handle an obsession, but all things considered, her eyes lingered on Danny's throat. Asking you to spend time with him is not an acceptable solution. Perhaps illusion magic. She trailed off, contemplative. Masters gaped like a fish, wide-eyed, like he couldn't believe this was under discussion. This was a man entirely too accustomed to doing anything he wanted, completely unchecked. You shouldn't, regardless, Bruce cut in, before Danny could protest. Danny gave him a dismayed look, and Bruce elaborated. Masters has proven himself willing and able to use a variety of abuse tactics on you. It would be unwise to allow him unsupervised contact with you before you've been educated on resisting those tactics. That's ridiculous, Master spat, with a mixture of fear and rage. All I have done is prove to Daniel how much he needs me. None of you will ever be as valuable to him as a more experienced half-ghost. Bruce glanced at Danny, just as Danny looked away from Masters. A mixture of sadness and resignation reflected in his eyes. Danny knew Masters was right. Bruce decided in that Masters had a great deal of valuable information that Danny needed, but he also knew that none of it was worth giving himself to Masters. Nightwing knew it too, and he tugged Danny to lean against him and put the cold pack back in his hands, encouraging him to start holding it to his neck again. The whole time, Nightwing never broke eye contact with Masters. Actually, Nightwing said with alarming calm, the value of a man who strangles a kid the moment he has them alone is approximately 0. Wasn't the moment, Danny mumbled, but didn't protest any further, instead relaxing against Nightwing and watching the activity with half lid eyes. That's not a compromise, Master snapped at presumably dead man. That's inhumane. Aren't you supposed to be good guys? The sneer was classic, and Bruce had to refrain from rolling his own eyes at the childishness. I could just shoot you in the head, Hood offered, flicking the safety off of his gun for effect. You do know me, don't you? 'Cause I'm starting to think you don't understand the position you're in, Masters. Danny's breath hitched, but he seemed to understand the game, 'cause he didn't speak up, even when Masters' eyes flickered to him. You suggested a plea deal? Masters forced out at last, looking at Zatanna. Zatanna nodded, glancing at Bruce. Dead Man suggested that a member of J.L. Dark could bring Masters ectoplasm and news of Danny once a week, she clarified. If we bound his powers, we could charge him only for his crimes against Danny, rather than attempting to find a way both hide his ghost half and charge him with crimes related to infinite realms. He'd still get... She trailed off expectantly, and Bruce grunted, adding up charges in his head. At least 2 counts of aggravated kidnapping, multiple counts of felony assault, child endangerment, stalking of a child, federal blackmail, and extortion, he said. I'll have to discuss the details with Danny, but at least 20 years, possibly life in prison. The death penalty would have to come off the table for numerous reasons. Why would I agree to any of that? Masters demanded. Because we can prove it in court, Bruce said calmly. And you're sorely mistaken if you think the sentence would be lighter if you were also charged with multiple counts of felony public endangerment and felony mind control and solicitation. He could almost see Masters running the numbers. As a billionaire, he'd be able to hire the best lawyers money could buy, and would probably even be able to wiggle his way out of some of the less solid charges. On the other hand, between Bruce and Oliver and the Justice League could also afford the very best. It was unlikely that he'd be able to squirm his way out of enough charges to make a difference. And then there was the risk associated with his inhuman identity. Masters slumped. Very well, he muttered bitterly. I suppose you have me in a bind. Tellingly, Danny relaxed. A soft breath of relief escaped him. After that, Bruce quickly accused them, herding everyone back to the jet, back to Gotham. Danny's legs were still trembling too much to stand, so Dick helped him up onto Bruce's back, looping his arms around his shoulders. Even that seemed a bit of a strain. Danny's breathing heavier until he finally let down into the seat. So, Dick said conventionally, moving around the jet to get everyone settled. His own way of unwinding after a mission. Kaz finally accepted an ice pack of her own. Jason leaned back with a groan, and Duke retreated to the back of the plane, threw his arms over his eyes. I understand 100% why the first thing you did when your parents got arrested was to make sure you wouldn't go to that guy. Danny snorted. Are you going to get the restraining order? Bruce has done it before for Steph, at least twice. We know the process. Bruce scowled. More traditional stalkers were particularly attracted to Stephanie, though Dick had needed to issue formal threats a few times himself. Danny hesitated, shifting in his seat with a pensive look. Can they be undone? Yes, Bruce said, moving to start up the bat plane. You would need to formally ask a court to change the order, but the details can be modified at any time. I'll discuss the specific requests that can be made tomorrow. And a known contact order would be their priority, but a search and seizure of any weapons on Master's property wouldn't be amiss. Danny nodded, relaxing slowly as he finally considered the idea seriously. Bruce was relieved too. He hadn't been sure Danny would agree to it. He turned the bat plane toward an empty stretch of field, preparing for a somewhat rough takeoff. "How's your throat?" Dick checked, changing the subject pointedly. Breathing, shallow movement. Confusion or pain? It was relatively rare for someone to catch one of them long enough to strangle them, but it wasn't completely unfamiliar injury. "Do you remember what happened?" From Danny's scrunched nose, he wasn't familiar with the check. Yeah, he rasped, grimaced as he swallowed visibly. "It's not a big deal. It's not like he was trying to choke me out or anything. I think he just likes the intimidation. He held me for a few seconds, then shocked me." He shrugged, went to rub his neck. Carely thought better of it. "He was rougher than usual, I guess, but I didn't pass out and I could still breathe okay. Still hurts, though." He'd been keeping his head very still as events progressed. Add to the list of lessons which injuries had the potential to take an abrupt turn for the worse. Bruce vividly remembered Jason waking up in the middle of the night, struggling to breathe. After a formerly inconspicuous neck injury, admittedly, Danny had unique ways of maintaining any sudden airway problems, but that wasn't a foolproof solution, and Frostbite's notes had stated very clearly he didn't know what effect serious brain injury might have. Apparently, ghosts didn't typically have brains. "You need to get formal medical attention for your wrist and throat," Bruce cut in before Dick could press further. "I'll introduce you to Leslie Tompkins. She does the majority of the serious medical procedures for all of us. We'll need to take Jason and Cass to her as well." Normally, he'd permit them to handle it at home, but hopefully they'd understand that he needed them to set an example this time. Jason grumbled but didn't protest, and Cass shrugged. Her leg kicked up to baby her knee injury. Unsurprisingly, Danny paled, making some of the burst veins in his face stand out. "What?" he squeaked. He tugged nervously on his collar. "I thought Alfred handled most of it. Broken bones and serious respiratory concerns are beyond his expertise," Bruce conceded. Alfred had made his boundaries in that respect very clear, outright refusing to allow his lack of experience to do them harm. He could stabilize a critical injury, but ultimately would need real medical professional. "For this, you'll need to see either Dr. Tompkins or I can take you to the League doctors." He wouldn't be entirely surprised if Danny was more comfortable with that despite the extra attention it would result in. "It's just a broken wrist," Danny protested, disregarding the strangulation entirely. "I'll handle those on my own, at home." "That is not sustainable," Bruce disagreed, adamant. "You're lucky you have gone 2 years without serious complications. You shouldn't count on it. You can go to Dr. Tompkins, or you can go to the League." Dick gave Bruce an exasperated look, something that was increasingly common as he gained more siblings, and a preferable alternative to yelling matches they had when he was younger. "You wouldn't need any treatments that the rest of us wouldn't get," Dick reassured Danny. "And she'll respect any boundaries that you put down, including asking her not to take your vitals. She worked with traumatized metas before, and like B said, she knows us. Steph snorted. Danny didn't look happy with it, but with an eye on him, he nodded in reluctant agreement. Bruce nodded back and finally pulled away to take off for Gotham. Get some rest, Dick encouraged him behind him. You look exhausted. Alfred was more than relieved to see them all back, and quietly settled everyone down to be checked over while he ushered Bruce, Danny, and Jason and Cass off to head to the clinic. Since it wasn't an emergency, it was more polite to meet her there. On the way there, Danny fidgeted unhappily, but didn't protest any further, hopefully soothed by Jason and Cass' complete lack of concern. Jason's uncharacteristic compliance was particularly telling in this case. Alfred called ahead, letting Leslie know to expect them, so she met them at the back door. Dr. Tompkins, Bruce greeted, inclining his head slightly. By now, Daniel had regained enough strength to stand, but his legs trembled under him, threatening his balance. Bruce took him under the cape and let him stay close, weary of any prying eyes. Batman? Leslie returned, eyeing Danny appraisingly. I suppose I'll be seeing this one out on the streets as well. Danny ducked his head and shied away from her, his grip tight on Bruce's arms. Bruce grunted, and Leslie stepped aside to let them in. The room was already set up for them. Did Agent A tell you what to expect? Leslie hummed. No vitals, no blood tests, no scans, she said. You'll realize I'll need to take an X-ray to set his wrist properly. Danny made a distressed sound. Bruce glanced back down at him. We'll have it destroyed afterwards if necessary, he said, steering Danny to one of 2 beds to sit down on. I assume you don't know what your X-rays look like. If they appeared normal, they would be useful evidence against Masters. Danny shook his head. Frostbite doesn't take those, he said with a helpless shrug, avoiding Leslie's eyes. And I have, other ways of checking that stuff out. Bruce hadn't considered the application of Danny's invisibility, implied that Danny could turn himself partially invisible, which could be incredibly useful in a variety of ways, which this was far from the least. We'll determine later which of your scans pass for normal, he said. For now, the X-rays are necessary. Danny hummed unhappily, drawing himself back away from Leslie, and cradled his hurt wrist against his stomach. His feet came up to the bed frame, both shielding himself and bracing for leverage, and he bared his teeth in a faint warning snarl. His hands trembled. Bruce glanced back up to meet Leslie's eyes. Fortunately, she responded to Danny's obvious unease and turned to Jason. Sit down so I can wrap your ribs, she instructed him, turning away to gather the compression bandages. Is there anything else that needs to be seen while you're here? Jason sat with a grunt and started pulling off his shirt jacket. No, Masters is a bitch. He smirked at Danny's soft huff of amusement. Mostly just got bruises to show for the whole thing. Kaz made a sound of agreement, sitting on a chair to wait her turn. He fights like a bully, she signed dismissively. Throws his strength around, but uncoordinated. Sloppy. Jason snorted and translated for Danny when he just looked lost. Danny smiled briefly, his eyes glittering with amusement. Masters responsible for that? Leslie asked with raised eyebrows, glancing at Danny. That's not going to look good for the courts. Bruce grunted in agreement. Red Robin's already collected photo evidence of most of it, he said. If the x-rays pass for human, I'd be appreciative of a copy for that as well. Leslie had certainly provided materials for court cases enough times to be familiar with the process. Leslie hummed and started to wrap Jason's ribs. Brisk but careful, Jason grunted and shut his eyes against the pain, waiting impatiently for Leslie to finish. So that's the situation, is it? Anything else I need to worry about? Not particularly, Bruce said, keeping an eye on Danny to monitor his reaction. Danny shrank down, hiding his face against his knees and shoulders tensing. Too exhausted to protest more than he already, Bruce decided. His physical structure is similar enough for the injury care to be nearly unaffected. He'll have the league medical team for anything else. Leslie nodded and asked Danny, "Are you comfortable telling me what you are?" Danny froze and glanced up at Bruce, pleading. Bruce carefully kept himself from reacting. Danny needed to become comfortable telling trustworthy allies without prompting. After a moment, Danny transferred his gaze back down to Leslie and hesitated, as if he thought she might pull a gun and shoot. Bruce let him sit with it. The fact that Danny's hero and ghost identities were inseparable meant that this conversation would happen many times, even if Danny decided to come up with an intermediary cover. "Ghost," Danny said at last quietly. "I don't really want to talk about it." "Intermediary cover it is," Bruce concluded. Leslie raised an eyebrow, and it was clear that she had some questions, but she at least had the grace not to ask them. Instead, she finished wrapping Jason's ribs, reminded him to make a point of breathing deeply, and went to Kaz while Jason redressed. Kaz let Leslie prod her knee without reacting, testing the damage and stability, and eventually Leslie wrapped it in a brace and nodded at her. That left Danny, and when Leslie turned to him, he shrank back, looking tempted to bolt. "Can you tell me what I'm looking at?" Leslie prompted, deliberately giving Danny more agency. Danny shifted in place, and Bruce nodded the behaviors. His hands tightly clenched, fists braced for leverage, his body oriented eerily toward Leslie despite his lowering gaze. Doctors were firmly a threat, Bruce decided, rather than someone to appease. "My wrist is broken, and my neck hurts," Danny said, soft and clipped. "And I got electrocuted a few times." "Can you tell me by what?" Leslie asked, appraising him. Jason leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, pretending to doze. But if Bruce knew him, he was monitoring the situation closely. "Meta ability." "That makes things trickier," Leslie admitted frankly, without approaching Danny's just yet. "Did you lose consciousness?" Danny shook his head, then winced, regretting it. "Did you have a seizure?" "No." Apparently, Danny was declined to shake his head again. "Have you noticed any heart palpitations, tremors, balance problems, confusion, or dizziness?" Leslie asked. Danny hesitated, then sighed, lifting his hands for a moment to let Leslie see they were shaking before dropping them back to his lap. "I hit my head a couple times," he muttered. "Masters hit your head a couple times." Jason disagreed without opening his eyes. Danny snorted softly. "The balance problem started after that," Danny continued, without looking at Leslie. "No heart stuff, no confusion. I was dizzy, but it cleared after a few hours." Danny hesitated and then went on without further prompting. All the breathing problems are in my neck. My chest is fine. I'm not having trouble staying awake, and my head hurts because I hit it. My hands are tingling, but nothing's numb. Leslie nodded slowly, adding that up in her head, and then asked, "Is your healing enhanced?" Danny nodded. "But you're still trembling." Danny tensed. "I suggest that someone qualified do some blood and urine tests to check severe muscle damage." Danny stiffened, his eyes widening. "No!" he snapped, raising his voice unexpectedly. "I don't need dialysis." He coughed and briefly choked on the resulting pain, lifting his hand to his throat. Bruce made a mental note to check whether Danny had been put on dialysis following his accident. "I recommend getting your blood tested in case of muscle damage," Leslie said, calm and careful, not threatening. "If you don't want to do that, then keep an eye out for signs of kidney failure. Do you know those?" Danny hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "Then, as long as you allow someone you trust to monitor your heart and breathing overnight, I think that's all for now." "Okay," Danny rasped without looking up. "Did you die of kidney failure?" Jason asked, sticking his hands into his pockets. His eyes were open again, but he still made a point of appearing relaxed. "I might have to make fun of you for that." Danny flinched at first, eyes darting up to Leslie, but when she didn't visibly react, he snorted, expression softening, even for his eyes to glitter with amusement. "No, my heart stopped, and then I had to go on dialysis anyways." "How BS is that?" "So completely," Jason agreed with a faint, worry smile tugging on his mouth. Bruce liked it. "Now, the strangulation," Leslie cut in, slow and calm. Danny tensed. "How long was your neck compressed?" Danny shrugged. "About 10, maybe 15 seconds?" he muttered, "give or take." Leslie pursed her lips. "Do you have any trouble breathing or speaking?" Danny stared at her. "Is it strangulation if you can breathe?" "Yes," Leslie said firmly. "Strangulation is any process applied to the neck with intent to harm, even if breathing isn't restricted. That can be extremely dangerous." "Huh. No, I couldn't breathe." Danny hesitated, opened his mouth and shut it, and curled up uncomfortably, declining to elaborate. Bruce reviewed what he knew and guessed that Danny could hold his breath longer than normal, though Bruce would have to find out exactly how long. Leslie nodded, accepting this. "Did you pass out or feel like you were going to pass out?" Danny grimaced. "Not until afterward. And that probably wasn't the strangulation. It was, the shock, the exhaustion, the head injury. I already had that at that point. It's not like he choked me out, technically." Leslie paused. "Electric shock? He strangled you, then shocked you?" Danny tilted his head and tapped one of the burns on his neck. "This man is trying for full custody?" Danny snorted. "I know, right?" Leslie gave Bruce a look that had, many times before, clearly indication destroy them before returning her attention to Danny. "Did you notice any changes to your vision during the assault, or any pain anywhere?" Danny paused, thinking about it, then offered, I kind of saw bright spots, and then he was crushing my neck, and all that hurt." "I should have crushed his neck," Jason muttered. Kaz hummed in agreement. "Any gaps in your memory or in consciousness?" Leslie prompted. No. And since then? Leslie asked. Any vision changes or unusual weakness or clumsiness? Not really. And have you had trouble speaking and swallowing? Breathing? Danny shrugged. I can speak fine. It just hurts. Breathing is a little restricted, not enough to bother me. Swallowing sucks, though. And an understatement, Bruce was sure, considering how he was reacting to swallowing compared to his Blaze response to his chemical burns his mother had gave him. On cue, Danny swallowed with a shudder, curling against his knees. Leslie nodded. May I touch your neck to assess the damage? Immediately, Danny recoiled, pulling sharply away from Leslie, till one foot was actively on the floor opposite side the bed, ready to flee. His ease compliance with Bruce earlier suddenly seemed much more relevant. Beat it, Danny said quickly, covering his neck with his hand. Without touching it, Bruce noted. Leslie looked at Bruce, and Bruce responded. I noticed no subcutaneous emphysema or excessive deformities. However, the entire area seemed to be extremely tender. The most pronounced part is which associated with the hyphoid bone. I would like to request an x-ray of that area. Danny shot him a betrayed look. While I wasn't able to access the carotid blurt since there was no other signs of airway injury, I do not believe it's necessary. All right, Leslie said calmly, looking at Danny. 2 x-rays then. After that, I can set your wrist and we'll discuss whether further treatment is needed for your neck. Danny nodded reluctantly, and they moved to the next room to get the x-rays completed. It didn't take long, close to half an hour, and then Leslie studied the results for a while before finally reporting back. First, both of these x-rays appear completely normal, Leslie said. Danny smiled brightly, his relief obvious, and Leslie continued. If you look closely, I can see a few extra fracture lines on your wrist, so you may want to be cautious with who sees them regardless. That's normal for a vigilante, and this particular x-ray shouldn't stand out. However, she pointed to the neck x-ray. Your hyphoid bone is fractured. How quickly do you typically heal? Danny shrugged. 4 days for a broken bone? He tapped his forearm, indicating which bone he was referring to. 2 days for a dislocated or a broken nose. 1 or 2 for concussion or most gashes. Once I broke my collarbone and we couldn't figure out how to set it. It took almost 2 weeks. Jazz had to keep distracting our parents so they wouldn't take me to the doctor. Leslie considered him for a moment, visibly decided not to ask any of her questions, and said instead, broken collarbones usually require surgery to set. For metas with enhanced healing, whom pins and rods are detrimental, we usually use clamps and splints to keep them for observation for the duration. Danny wrinkled his nose, eventually not thrilled with that idea, and Bruce asked, Do you typically treat such injuries with your abilities? He could see how much Meta teenager would prefer that shortcut, but he knew Leslie had strong opinions about such things. Danny started to shake his head, stiffened, and then gave Leslie an uneasy glance before answering. I don't like to. There's too much that can go wrong, but I have open fractures back that way before. He shrugged. It's fitty, But it works? He paused for a moment, considering something, then added, with the collarbone, I made a pin in my parents' workshop and phased it in to hold it together. I had muscle cramps in that shoulder for 4 days, but the collarbone healed. He smiled ruefully. Bruce repressed the urge to pinch his nose and elaborated to Leslie. Many aspects of Danny's abilities operate on magical logic, meaning it's based more in the intent than physics. Do you have a recommendation? This was a rhetorical question. He needed to make sure Danny internalized this. Khan had more than once tried to set an injury using DK with disastrous results. My recommendation is the same as always, which is not attempt any surgical procedure without help of a qualified doctor, Leslie said firmly. But if any mistakes can be repaired later, it sounds like a plausible emergency measure. Danny gave Leslie a smile, then closed for real. The worst thing that can happen is that I phase parts into each other and can't get them straightened out again, he reassured her. It'll be fine as long as I can get everything pulled apart and lined up properly. Leslie nodded and returned to the original topic. At the rate of healing, your hyoid bone should heal 3 days at most. Till then, keep your diet soft or liquid. Sleep with something that supports your neck and try not to strain your throat. Danny wrinkled his nose at the diet requirements, but didn't protest, probably remembering how much it hurt to swallow. Okay, that just leaves my wrist, right? Yes. Leslie smiled at him. Let's get that in a brace, and then you can go home. I'll send a copy of your x-rays along.